Before you left your house today, you probably grabbed a shirt, zipped a jacket, or tied your shoes without giving it a second thought. It took less than a minute, but that tiny habit connects you to one of the biggest turning points in human history. There was a time when nobody wore clothes. No shirts, no trousers, no shoes. Not because they couldn't make them, but because nobody had yet imagined the idea. So what changed? Why did one species, out of millions of animals on Earth, decide to cover its body? The answer isn't just about surviving winter. It's a story hidden inside parasites, ice age caves, and one of the strangest evolutionary mysteries scientists have ever solved. For most of the 300,000 years that Homo sapiens have walked this planet, clothing wasn't something you bought. It wasn't something you folded into a wardrobe. It wasn't even guaranteed to exist. So when did ancient humans first decide to cover themselves? The obvious answer seems simple: because they were cold. Except the evidence suggests the story is far more complicated than that. In fact, one of the biggest clues doesn't come from ancient campsites or frozen caves. It comes from lice. Yes, lice. Tiny parasites accidentally recorded one of the most important moments in human history long before humans ever learned to write it down. And once you understand what they reveal, you begin to realize that clothing didn't simply change how humans survived. It changed what it meant to be human. Let's go back. Imagine waking up roughly 170,000 years ago, somewhere in Eastern Africa. The sun has barely risen above the horizon. The air is cool after the night, but it will become brutally hot before midday. Around you stretches an endless landscape of grasslands, scattered trees, and rocky outcrops. Somewhere in the distance, antelope are already moving. Predators are returning from the night's hunt. You stand up, you don't put on trousers, you don't lace up boots, you don't even think about it. Because nobody around you owns clothes the way we understand them today. And strangely enough, that's perfectly normal. For millions of years, your ancestors had survived without woven fabrics, stitched garments, or wardrobes. Like every other primate, they relied on their own bodies, which raises an obvious question. Why are humans so different from almost every other large mammal alive today? Look around the animal kingdom. Chimpanzees have thick hair, gorillas have thick hair, bears, wolves, horses, and lions all carry natural insulation wherever they go. Humans don't. Compared with other primates, we're remarkably hairless. That isn't an accident. It's one of the most unusual adaptations in mammalian evolution. Researchers have proposed several explanations, but the strongest evidence points toward thermoregulation. Roughly 2 million years ago, our ancestors were spending more time moving across open African landscapes. Instead of short bursts of speed, they increasingly relied on endurance. They walked long distances. They tracked animals for hours. Sometimes they simply kept following exhausted prey until it collapsed from overheating. This hunting strategy is known as persistence hunting. It sounds almost unbelievable. Humans aren't particularly fast. A zebra can outrun you. So can a gazelle. But neither can sweat like you can. Humans possess between 2 and 4 million eccrine sweat glands spread across almost the entire body. As sweat evaporates, it carries heat away from the skin, allowing us to keep moving long after most mammals must stop to cool down. It's one of humanity's greatest evolutionary advantages. Research by Peter Wheeler, and later work by Daniel Lieberman and Dennis Bramble, suggests that losing much of our body hair dramatically improved our ability to regulate heat during prolonged activity. In other words, our ancestors became marathon runners before they became farmers. But every evolutionary advantage comes with a cost. Losing fur solved one problem. It created another. Without thick body hair, human skin became exposed. The African sun became harsher. Thorn bushes became more painful. Insects found easier targets. Even relatively cool nights could become uncomfortable. Suddenly, the naked ape had a problem no other large mammal faced quite the same way. And eventually, someone solved it. But here's where the story becomes fascinating. Most people imagine that clothing appeared when humans left Africa and entered colder climates. It seems obvious. Cold weather arrives, humans get cold. Humans invent clothes. Simple. Except archaeology and genetics suggest the timeline doesn't fit quite so neatly. Modern humans are generally believed to have expanded out of Africa in major waves roughly 70,000 years ago. Yet some of the strongest biological evidence for habitual clothing points significantly earlier. So where does that evidence come from? Not leather, not textiles, not needles, parasites. Here's why. Humans host 2 closely related species of lice. Head lice spend their lives in human hair. Body lice don't. Body lice live almost entirely inside clothing. They hide in seams and folds before crawling onto the skin to feed. Without clothing, they simply cannot survive. This tiny detail turned out to be incredibly important. In 2003, geneticists led by Ralph Kittler, Mark Stoneking, and colleagues compared the DNA of head lice and body lice. Their goal wasn't actually fashion history, it was evolutionary biology. But what they discovered transformed our understanding of prehistoric clothing. Using molecular genetics, they estimated when body lice diverged from head lice. That split could only have happened after humans had begun wearing clothing regularly enough for an entirely new ecological niche to exist. The result was astonishing. Depending on the genetic model, habitual clothing likely emerged somewhere between approximately 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. Think about that. A parasite preserved evidence of ancient clothing better than clothing itself, because fabric almost never survives. Animal hides decay. Plant fibers rot. Leather disappears. After tens of thousands of years, almost nothing remains. But evolution remembered. The lice recorded the moment our ancestors created an entirely new environment for another species. It's one of the cleverest pieces of detective work in archaeology. Of course, that date doesn't tell us exactly what those early clothes looked like. The first clothing was probably astonishingly simple. Perhaps an animal hide draped across the shoulders, perhaps strips of bark, perhaps bundles of grasses, maybe nothing more than a loose wrap held together with sinew or plant fibers. The point wasn't fashion, not yet. It was function. But what function? Cold is only part of the answer. Remember where many of these people still lived. Large areas of Africa. Not Ice Age Europe, not Siberia, not the Arctic. So researchers have proposed another explanation. Protection. Imagine walking barefoot through thorn scrub every day. Imagine spending hours pushing through dense vegetation while tracking wounded animals. Imagine clouds of biting insects gathering around every exposed patch of skin. A simple animal hide suddenly becomes much more valuable. It blocks sunlight. It reduces scratches. It helps prevent infected cuts. It provides a barrier against insects. None of these advantages requires freezing temperatures. Sometimes evolution isn't driven by one dramatic problem. Sometimes it's driven by dozens of small annoyances repeated every single day for thousands of generations. But here's the thing. Humans almost never stop with practicality. We modify everything. We decorate everything. We assign meaning to almost everything we touch. And there are intriguing hints that this tendency may stretch far deeper into prehistory than many people realize. Long before woven cloth appears in the archaeological record, ancient humans were already collecting pigments. Red ochre, in particular, appears at numerous Middle Stone Age sites across Africa. Some pieces were deliberately ground into powder. Others show scraping marks. Researchers have found evidence suggesting ochre was used for body painting, hide processing, adhesives, and perhaps symbolic behavior. Exactly how it was used remains debated. But one thing seems clear. Our ancestors weren't interacting with materials purely for survival. They were experimenting, decorating, creating, expressing. At South Africa's Blombos cave, archaeologists uncovered engraved pieces of ochre dating to roughly 75,000 years ago, along with shell beads that were almost certainly worn as personal ornaments. Suddenly, the human body wasn't just a biological object, it was becoming a canvas. And once humans begin modifying their appearance, an interesting possibility emerges. Perhaps clothing wasn't only about protecting the body, perhaps it also became a way of communicating something about the person wearing it. Not necessarily fashion in the modern sense, but identity, group membership, age, status, achievement. Nobody can prove exactly when this transition occurred. Organic clothing almost never survives. Meaning doesn't fossilize. But anthropologists have noticed something remarkable. Across virtually every known culture, humans don't simply wear clothing. They personalize it. They decorate it. They transform it into a language. That pattern appears again and again throughout history, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the first clothing solved practical problems, but humans almost immediately began using it for social ones. And if that's true, the story is only getting started, because around 50,000 years ago, archaeologists begin finding something that changes clothing forever. Not fabric, not leather, a tool, tiny, delicate, easy to overlook, but capable of transforming loose animal skins into garments that actually fit the human body. the sewing needle. And that tiny invention would allow our ancestors to survive places that had previously been almost impossible for humans to inhabit. But that's where the story takes another extraordinary turn. Around 50,000 years ago, something extraordinary appears in the archaeological record. Not the first fire, not the first spear, not the first cave painting, a sewing needle. It doesn't look impressive. It's only a few centimeters long, made from bone, polished smooth by patient hands. A tiny eye carefully drilled through one end so that sinew or plant fiber could pass through it. But that little hole changed the future of our species. The oldest confirmed-eyed needles have been found in Denisova cave in southern Siberia and date to roughly 45,000 to 50,000 years ago. They are astonishingly sophisticated. Whoever made them understood precision engineering long before anyone built a wheel or wrote a sentence. Think about what that required. First, someone had to select the right bone, then shape it without snapping it, then polish it smooth enough that thread wouldn't catch, then drill an opening no wider than a few millimeters without splitting the entire object. Finally, they had to imagine a garment that didn't yet exist. That isn't trial and error. That's planning. That's abstract thinking. That's design. Archaeologist Ian Gilligan has argued that tailored clothing represented one of the most important technological developments of the late Pleistocene because properly fitted garments dramatically improved insulation in cold environments. Loose hides certainly offered protection, but stitched clothing trapped warm air against the body far more efficiently. That difference mattered. A lot. Without tailored clothing, surviving Ice Age Siberia would have been extraordinarily difficult. With it, humans suddenly gained access to environments that had previously been beyond their limits. The world became larger. Not because the climate changed, because technology did. But here's something that's often forgotten. Modern humans weren't the only people making clothes. For a long time, history was told as though Homo sapiens invented every important innovation, while everyone else struggled to keep up. The archaeological evidence paints a more complicated picture. Neanderthals had been living in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived. They endured repeated ice ages. They hunted enormous animals. They survived winters that would kill an unprotected person within hours. They almost certainly weren't doing that naked. Archaeologists have discovered stone scrapers showing wear patterns consistent with hide preparation. Animal bones preserve cut marks indicating skins were carefully removed rather than simply discarded. Chemical residues on tools suggest repeated leatherworking. Everything points in the same direction. Neanderthals processed hides. They almost certainly wore clothing. Exactly how sophisticated that clothing became is still debated. We haven't found preserved Neanderthal garments. Organic materials almost never survive that long, but very few researchers today doubt they relied heavily on animal skins. In other words, clothing wasn't uniquely human, at least not uniquely Homo sapiens. Different human species, facing similar environmental challenges, arrived at remarkably similar solutions. That's one of the most fascinating patterns in evolution. Sometimes intelligence doesn't invent completely different answers. It discovers the same good idea again and again. And then there are the Denisovans. Until 2010, nobody even knew they existed. Scientists identified them from DNA extracted from a tiny finger bone found inside Denisova cave. Since then, they've become one of the greatest archaeological mysteries on Earth. We know surprisingly little about them, yet they occupied some of the harshest environments inhabited by ancient humans. The famous bone needle from Denisova cave comes from archaeological layers associated with this remarkable site. Although researchers cannot say with certainty whether it was made by Denisovans or by modern humans who later occupied the cave. That's an important distinction. Science is strongest when it admits uncertainty. Still, one conclusion is difficult to escape. Whoever produced those needles possessed extraordinary technical skill, and once humans could reliably sew fitted garments, everything changed. People spread farther north. Longer winters became survivable. Seasonal migrations expanded. Entire landscapes that had once been deadly gradually became home. Clothing wasn't simply keeping people warm, it was reshaping the geography of humanity. But here's where the story becomes even stranger. If clothing were only about survival, every culture would eventually settle on the same design. The warmest coat, the strongest sandals, the most efficient cloak. End of story. That's not what happened. Instead, humans did something no other animal appears to do. We made clothing mean something. Look throughout history. Ancient Egyptian priests wore garments unlike ordinary laborers. Roman senators displayed distinctive purple borders that signaled political authority. Medieval kings reserved luxurious fabrics for the elite. Samurai, Viking warriors, Maasai elders, Chinese emperors, and countless indigenous societies all developed clothing traditions that communicated identity before a single word was spoken. Your clothes could reveal your profession, your family, your beliefs, your wealth, sometimes even your marital status. Anthropologists often describe clothing as one of humanity's oldest nonverbal communication systems. It tells stories. It creates belonging. It separates insiders from outsiders. And unlike spoken language, everyone understands it instantly. Long before someone introduced themselves, you already knew something about them. That idea may feel surprisingly modern. It isn't. Evidence for personal ornament stretches back tens of thousands of years. Shell beads, animal teeth, ivory pendants, pierced claws, colored pigments. People invested enormous effort creating objects that served little practical purpose beyond communication and identity. Clothing gradually joined that symbolic world, not overnight, probably not even intentionally. But once people realized that appearance could communicate information, clothing became something much larger than protection. It became culture. Consider one remarkable discovery. In Zudzuwana Cave, in present-day Georgia, archaeologists uncovered twisted flax fibers dating to around 30,000 years ago. Some had been dyed. Think about that. Someone spent time coloring fibers that already worked perfectly well without color. They weren't improving insulation. They were changing appearance. That tiny decision echoes all the way to the present. Every colored shirt, every patterned scarf, every ceremonial robe, every national costume, every football jersey, every wedding dress, every military uniform, it all traces back to the uniquely human tendency to give ordinary objects symbolic meaning. Of course, clothing never stopped being practical. If anything, practical importance increased. Between roughly 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, Earth experienced dramatic climatic fluctuations. Glaciers expanded, rainfall shifted, large parts of Africa became drier, resources became unpredictable. Genetic evidence suggests human populations may have passed through severe bottlenecks during parts of the late Pleistocene, although the exact numbers remain debated. What isn't debated is that survival became harder. Groups capable of making better shelters, better fire, better tools, and better clothing gained enormous advantages. Every successful innovation spread through learning. Parents taught children. Children taught grandchildren. Knowledge accumulated. Unlike biological evolution, cultural evolution can move astonishingly fast. A useful idea doesn't wait for genes. It spreads through conversation, observation, practice. That may be the greatest human adaptation of all. We inherit knowledge from people we've never met. By the beginning of the Neolithic, around 10,000 years ago, clothing had become far more than stitched animal hides. People cultivated flax for linen. Sheep provided wool. Later, cotton transformed societies across Asia. Silk connected China to the Mediterranean through trade routes that reshaped world history. Entire cities grew wealthy because of textiles. Some of history's most important trade networks existed largely because humans wanted better fabrics. Imagine explaining that to one of those early hunter-gatherers wrapping an antelope skin around their shoulders. A simple survival tool eventually helped build kingdoms. That's one of history's recurring themes. The smallest inventions often produce the biggest consequences. But perhaps the most remarkable part of this story isn't technological at all. It's psychological. Tomorrow morning, you'll probably get dressed without thinking very much about it. You'll choose something comfortable, or practical, or appropriate for work, or suitable for the weather. Maybe you'll wear your favorite color. Maybe you'll avoid a shirt because you've worn it twice already this week. Those decisions feel personal, modern, ordinary. Yet beneath them lies a behavioral tradition stretching back well over 100,000 years. Your ancestors also balanced practicality with appearance, protection with identity, function with expression, not exactly as we do today, but recognizably. That's the surprising lesson archaeology keeps teaching us. Ancient humans weren't strange creatures completely unlike ourselves. They worried, adapted, invented, experimented, solved problems, expressed identity, built traditions, just like we do. The first person who wrapped an animal hide around their shoulders probably wasn't thinking about fashion. They were thinking about survival. The person who later stitched that hide into a fitted garment was thinking about craftsmanship. The person who added decoration may have been thinking about belonging. And somewhere along that long journey, clothing became something much bigger than protection. It became one of humanity's oldest languages, one that every one of us still speaks every single day. The remarkable thing isn't that ancient humans started wearing clothes. The remarkable thing is how quickly a simple survival technology became part of our identity. That's what humans do. We solve a problem, then we tell stories about the solution, then we turn it into culture. And eventually, we can't imagine life without it. So the next time you button a shirt, tie your shoes, or pull on a jacket before walking outside, remember this. You're continuing a tradition that began somewhere in prehistoric Africa, evolved through Ice Age winters, spread across continents, and helped our species survive environments our ancestors could once only dream of reaching. That's an extraordinary legacy hidden inside one of the most ordinary parts of your day. And maybe that's the real lesson. History isn't only buried beneath ancient ruins. Sometimes it's hanging quietly in your wardrobe. If this story changed the way you look at something as ordinary as getting dressed, let me know in the comments. What surprised you most? Was it the lice that preserved the earliest evidence of clothing, the incredible bone needles from the Ice Age, or the idea that clothing became one of humanity's first forms of communication? I read as many of your comments as I can, and many of our best future episodes come directly from your suggestions. If you enjoy exploring the forgotten lives of our ancestors through real archaeology, anthropology, and evolutionary science, subscribe to Forgotten Ancestors and join us for the next journey into humanity's deep past. Because the more we uncover about our ancestors, the more we discover about ourselves.